The smell of ozone and burnt metal still fills my nostrils when I close my eyes, even after all these years. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, feeling like I'm floating in an infinite, silent void. At those times, I have to turn on all the lights in the room and touch solid objects to make sure I'm really back on Earth, back home. But will we ever really be back? My name doesn't matter. What matters is the story I carry with me, a story that should never have happened and which, for many years, was kept secret. A story about our last mission to the moon and why, in 1990, we were categorically warned never to return. It all started in 1988. I was a young astronaut, newly selected for the space program. My eyes lit up at the prospect of exploring the cosmos, following in the footsteps of giants like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Little did I know that my journey would lead me to question everything we knew about our closest celestial neighbor. The mission was announced with great fanfare. We would be the first to establish a permanent lunar base. The world watched with renewed anticipation as we prepared for what would be humanity's next great leap. Our team consisted of 6 members, myself, as a lunar geology expert, Dr. Samantha Chen, our biologist, Major Robert Hawkins, the mission commander, Lisa Novak, a systems engineer, Dr. Marcus Reeves, an astrophysicist, and Carlos Oliveira, our onboard physician. The months of training were intense, endless simulations, exhaustive physical tests and technical briefings that never seemed to end. But nothing could have prepared us for what we would encounter. The launch took place on a clear October morning in 1989. The deafening roar of the engines, the crushing pressure of acceleration, and then silence. The silence of space is something that no amount of training can really simulate. It's a void that swallows up everything, even your thoughts. Our trip to the moon was uneventful, at least initially. We watched through the window of the spacecraft as the blue and green orb we call home diminished, and the gray, cratered disk of the moon grew before us. It was breathtaking, but also unsettling. The closer we got, the more I felt an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The landing was perfect, exactly as we had practiced thousands of times. We touched down on the lunar soil with a smoothness that would have made our instructors smile with pride. The first few hours were pure euphoria. We established our base, a modular structure that would be our home for the next 6 months, and began our assigned tasks. It was during our 3rd excursion to the surface that things began to change. I was collecting soil samples about 2 kilometers from the base when my radiation detector started beeping furiously. At first, I thought it was a malfunction. The levels it indicated were absurdly high for what we knew of the moon. "Base, this is Anderson," I called over the radio, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm getting anomalous radiation readings. Can you confirm?" Lisa's voice came crackling over the comm. "Negative, Anderson. Our sensors aren't showing anything out of the ordinary. Are you sure your equipment is working properly?" Before I could answer, I felt something, a subtle vibration under my feet, barely perceptible through the thick sole of my space boot. Then I saw it, a thin, pulsating line of bluish light snaking across the lunar soil a few meters from where I stood. "Damn," I muttered, momentarily forgetting that my microphone was open. "What was that, Anderson?" Major Hawkins' voice sounded, now with a note of concern. "Major, you're not going to believe this, but there's something here, a kind of... I don't know how to describe it. It's like a vein of energy pulsing through the ground." There was a moment of radio silence before Hawkins replied, "Stay where you are. We're coming to you." The next few minutes seemed to drag on forever as I watched, fascinated and terrified, the line of light slowly expand, forming a complex pattern on the lunar soil. It was as if the moon itself was awakening, revealing veins of unknown power. When the rest of the team arrived, everyone was momentarily speechless. Dr. Chen was the first to recover from the shock. "I'm possible," she muttered, kneeling down to examine the phenomenon more closely. Dr. Reeves immediately began taking readings with his instruments, muttering incomprehensible calculations to himself. Major Hawkins maintained his military posture, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "We need to report this immediately to Mission Control," he finally said. But before we could do anything, the light pattern began to pulse faster, expanding at an alarming rate. A low hum filled the air, increasing in intensity until we could feel it reverberating in our bones, even through our spacesuits. "Fall back! Everyone fall back now!" shouted Hawkins. But it was too late. A burst of light momentarily blinded us. When my vision cleared, I saw with horror that the ground around us had been transformed. Craters that we had known for decades had disappeared, replaced by strange, alien rock formations. And at the center of it all stood a structure that defied comprehension, a black crystal tower that stretched towards the stars, pulsating with the same blue light we had seen on the ground. At that moment, I realized that everything we thought we knew about the moon, about space, about our own history, was about to change forever. And the fear I felt was not just because of the unknown that lay before us, but because of the terrible suspicion that perhaps we weren't alone up here. And worse still, perhaps we had never been. The silence that followed was deafening. 6 figures in spacesuits, paralyzed in the face of a revelation that shook the foundations of our understanding of the universe. It was Carlos who finally broke the silence, his voice trembling slightly. What? What the hell just happened? No one had an answer. We were facing something that went beyond our science, beyond our imagination. The moon, our familiar and apparently inert satellite, had revealed itself as something completely different, something alive, something conscious. And as we watched helplessly, the black crystal tower began to emit a sound, a low, melodic wail that penetrated our minds, carrying with it a clear and terrifying warning. "You are not ready. Go home. Don't come back." Little did we know that this was only the beginning of a nightmare that would change the course of human history and force us to face truths that we may not have been prepared to accept. The warning reverberated in our minds, an ominous echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We stood there, paralyzed, for what seemed like an eternity, until Major Hawkins' voice brought us back to reality. "Team-wide, pull yourselves together. We need to get back to base immediately and report this to Mission Control." His voice was firm, but I could detect a subtle tremor that betrayed his own shock. Slowly, as if awakened from a collective trance, we began to move back towards our lunar base. The way back was surreal. The lunar landscape, once familiar in its desolation, now seemed strange and threatening. The new rock formations cast bizarre shadows under the Earth's light. And with every step, I had the feeling that the ground might open up beneath our feet, revealing more hidden secrets. When we arrived at the base, Lisa immediately began preparing the transmission to Earth. Her hands were shaking slightly as she adjusted the controls. "Mission Control, this is Artemis Moonbase. We have a situation, an unbelievable situation to report." The silence that followed was oppressive. We all knew that what we were about to say would change everything. The mission director's voice came through the speakers, tense and worried. "Artemis, this is Control. Proceed with your report." Major Hawkins took the floor, describing in clinical detail what we had witnessed. As he spoke, I watched the expressions of my teammates. Dr. Chen was biting his lip, his eyes fixed on a distant point. Dr. Reeves was muttering to himself, scribbling incomprehensible equations on a piece of paper. Carlos seemed to be in a state of shock, his face pale and his hands visibly shaking. When Hawkins finished his report, there was a long silence on the other side. Finally, the mission director's voice came back, now noticeably more serious. "Artemis, hold your positions. Do not approach the anomaly again. We're calling an emergency meeting here. We'll be back in touch shortly." The transmission ended, leaving us in a heavy silence. It was Dr. Chen who finally broke the silence. "That doesn't make sense. How could something like this exist on the moon without our having detected it before? Decades of observations, previous missions. How did it escape us?" Dr. Reeves looked up from his calculations, his gaze distant and troubled. Maybe it didn't escape. Maybe someone already knew." His words hung in the air, loaded with disturbing implications. The idea that such a discovery could have been concealed was almost as shocking as the discovery itself. The next few hours were a blur of frantic discussions, increasingly wild theories, and a growing tension that threatened to suffocate us. Each of us dealt with the situation differently. I found myself obsessively reviewing my geological samples, looking for any clues I might have missed. Lisa checked and rechecked our systems, as if expecting our reality to return to normal at any moment. It was in the middle of the night, at least according to our Earth-adjusted clocks, that something changed. A low sound, almost at the limit of hearing, began to permeate the base. It was like a hum, but with an almost melodic quality that made my hair stand on end. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice sounding strangely loud in the silence of the base. The others nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and fascination. Slowly, we gathered in the main room, looking at each other for answers that no one had. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. In the silence that followed, we noticed something even more disturbing. All our communications with Earth had ceased. "Now that's impossible," muttered Lisa, her fingers flying over the controls. "All the systems are working perfectly, but there's nothing, no signal." The realization of what this meant hit us like a punch in the gut. We were completely alone, isolated on the surface of a world we had just discovered we didn't really know. It was at that moment that Carlos let out a muffled shout, pointing at one of the base's windows. We followed his gaze, and what we saw made my blood run cold. Outside, in the lunar landscape that should have been dark and empty, there were lights. Dozens, maybe hundreds of tiny dots of bluish light, moving in complex, hypnotic patterns. "My God!" whispered Major Hawkins, his voice shaking for the first time since I'd met him. "We're not alone here." The lights seemed to be getting closer to the base, dancing and pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost intelligent. And as they got closer, the buzzing returned, louder and more insistent than before. Dr. Reeves was the first to verbalize what we were all thinking. "They're trying to communicate with us." The question that no one dared ask hung in the air. Should we try to answer it? The next few hours were a test of nerves the likes of which we had never experienced. We debated furiously about what to do. Major Hawkins insisted that we should follow protocol and wait for instructions from Earth. But with our communications cut off, this was looking more and more like an unfeasible option. Dr. Chen argued that we should try to establish contact. "This could be the greatest discovery in human history," she said, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and scientific excitement. I found myself torn. Part of me desperately wanted to understand what was going on, to unlock the secrets that the moon had kept for so long. But another part, a primal and instinctive part, was screaming for us to run away, to return to the relative safety of our blue planet. While we argued, the lights continued their hypnotic dance outside. The humming had turned into a kind of singing, an alien melody that seemed to resonate not only in our ears, but in our very minds. It was Carlos who finally made the decision for us. In a moment of apparent madness or supreme bravery, he headed for the decompression chamber. "Carlos, what the hell are you doing?" shouted Major Hawkins, running towards him. But it was too late. Carlos had already sealed the inner chamber and was in the process of opening the outer one. We watched, horrified and fascinated, as he took a step out onto the lunar surface. The lights immediately converged on him, enveloping him in a cocoon of bluish energy. For a terrible moment, I thought we would see him disintegrate before our eyes. But then something even more incredible happened. Carlos began to float, suspended in the air by the energy that surrounded him. And when he turned to look at us through the visor of his helmet, his eyes glowed with the same blue light as the entities that surrounded him. His voice came through our communicators, but it was no longer Carlos' voice. It was something else, something ancient and powerful. "The time has come. The Guardians have awakened. Humanity must prove its worth or face judgment." And with those words, Carlos and the lights disappeared, leaving us alone with the crushing weight of a revelation that threatened to redefine not only our mission, but the entire history of humanity. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of our own hearts beating frantically. We were facing something that went beyond our comprehension, beyond our science, beyond everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe. And as panic began to set in, one thing became clear. Our mission had changed dramatically. We were no longer here to establish a lunar base. We were here to face a cosmic test, a trial whose rules we didn't know and whose consequences could determine the fate of all humanity. Carlos' disappearance left us in a state of paralyzing shock. For long moments, we stood there, staring at the spot where he had disappeared, as if we expected him to reappear at any moment, laughing and saying that it was all just a collective hallucination. But he didn't come back, and the reality of our situation began to weigh on us like a concrete slab. "We need to go after him." Dr. Chen was the first to break the silence, her voice shaky but determined. Major Hawkins shook his head, his face a mask of concern and conflict. "Negative. We can't risk losing anyone else. We need to think rationally about this." "Rationally?" Dr. Reeves let out a bitter laugh. "There's nothing rational about all this. We're dealing with something that defies every law of physics we know." While they argued, my mind wandered, going over everything we had seen and experienced since we arrived on the moon. Something didn't fit. There was a pattern, a hidden logic that I couldn't quite decipher. "The Guardians," I muttered, more to myself than to the others. But my voice must have been louder than I intended, because everyone turned to me. "What did you say?" asked Lisa, her eyes wide. "The Guardians," I repeated, louder this time. Carlos, or whatever was speaking through him, mentioned Guardians. What if the moon isn't just a natural satellite? What if it's some kind of outpost, a sentinel? The silence that followed was heavy, laden with the weight of the implications of my words. "That's crazy," said Major Hawkins, but his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Reeves, however, looked puzzled. "Actually, that would explain a lot. The anomalies we've always detected but have never been able to fully explain. The way the moon affects the tides, the biological cycles." "But guardians of what?" asked Dr. Chen. "And why now? Why reveal yourself after all this time?" Before anyone could answer, a violent tremor shook the base. Alarms began to sound everywhere, and lights flashed ominously. "Status report!" shouted Hawkins, running to the main console. Lisa was already there, her fingers flying over the controls. "All the systems are going crazy. It's as if, like the moon itself is moving." I ran to one of the windows, and what I saw made my heart stop. The lunar landscape was changing before our eyes. Rocks were moving as if they were alive, forming complex patterns on the surface and in the sky. "Oh my God," I whispered. "Look!" Everyone joined me at the window, and a collective gasp of astonishment and terror escaped our lips. Earth, our beautiful blue planet, seemed to be moving away. Or rather, it was we who were moving away from it. "That's impossible," muttered Dr. Reeves, his face as pale as a ghost. "The moon can't just change its orbit like that." But that was exactly what seemed to be happening. And as we moved further away from the Earth, something even more incredible began to happen. The moon's surface began to open up, revealing complex structures and alien machinery that had remained hidden for millennia. It was as if we were witnessing the awakening of a sleeping giant. The moon, which we had always considered an inert celestial body, was revealing itself as an artificial construction of unimaginable proportions. "It's a spaceship," said Lisa, her voice barely above a whisper. "The whole moon is a spaceship." The implications of this revelation were overwhelming. All human knowledge about astronomy, about the formation of the solar system, about our own history, everything would have to be rewritten. But we didn't have much time to process this information. A new tremor, even more violent than the previous one, shook the base. And then we heard that voice again, the voice that had spoken through Carlos, now coming from everywhere at once. "The hour of judgment has come. The children of Earth will be tested, their evolution will be assessed, their fate will be decided." A beam of intense light erupted from the center of the moon, projecting towards the Earth. And with horror, we saw our base begin to disintegrate around us. "Spacesuits, now!" shouted Hawkins, running to the equipment compartment. In a frenzy of desperate movements, we managed to get our suits on. We had barely finished when the last wall of the base gave way, exposing us to the vacuum of space. For a terrible moment, I thought we were going to be launched into deep space. But something kept us anchored to the lunar surface, an invisible force that held us, preventing us from floating away. And then we saw it. Huge figures, made of light and energy, emerging from the newly revealed structures of the moon. They were the Guardians, beings of a scale and power that defied human comprehension. One of them approached us, its form changing and floating as if it were made of liquid light. When he spoke, his voice reverberated not only in our ears, but in our very minds. "Welcome, children of Earth. You have been chosen to represent your species in the great test. The fate of your world rests on your shoulders." I looked at my companions, their faces visible through the visors of their helmets. I saw fear, confusion, but also fierce determination. We were facing something beyond our comprehension, something that threatened not just our lives, but the existence of all humanity. And at that moment, I understood why we had been warned never to return to the moon. It wasn't a warning to stay away. It was a warning about what would happen when we returned. A warning about the awakening of the Guardians and the beginning of a cosmic test for which humanity might not be prepared. The Guardian extended what looked like a hand made of pure light towards us. "Come," he said, his voice echoing in our minds. "The test begins now." And with that, we were enveloped in an energy field, rising from the lunar surface. As we ascended towards the unknown, my last thought was of the Earth, shining lonely in the distance. Would we ever see it again? As we approached the alien structures that had emerged from the moon, I began to notice details that my human eyes could barely process. Surfaces that seemed to change color and texture every second. Impossible angles that defied the laws of Euclidean geometry. And a pulsating glow that seemed to emanate from within the structure itself. Dr. Chen, ever the scientist, was muttering observations into her communicator, trying to catalog everything she saw. The architecture is like nothing we've ever seen before. It seems alive. "Focus, team," Major Hawkins' voice sounded on our communicators, tense but controlled. "Remember your training, stay united and alert." But what training could prepare us for this? We were about to face a test created by beings whose existence we had just discovered, with the fate of all humanity at stake. When we finally landed on a platform inside the structure, the Guardian who was guiding us materialized before us. His form was even more impressive up close, a whirlwind of light and energy that seemed to contain entire galaxies within itself. "The test consists of 3 challenges," his voice rang out in our minds. "Each one will assess a different aspect of your species: intelligence, compassion, will." I looked at my companions, seeing my own fear and determination reflected in their eyes. "What if we fail?" asked Lisa, her voice trembling slightly. The Guardian was silent for a moment before replying, "Then your species will be judged unfit, and the Earth experiment will be terminated." The weight of those words fell on us like a ton of bricks. We weren't just fighting for our own lives, but for the survival of all humanity. "We're ready," said Major Hawkins, his voice firm despite the gravity of the situation. The Guardian nodded, or at least made a movement that we interpreted as nodding. "Then let the test begin." And with that, the world around us began to change. The walls of the structure dissolved into a swirl of light and color, and we found ourselves transported to a completely new environment. We were in a circular room, surrounded by symbols and equations that floated in the air like holograms. In the center of the room, there was a pedestal with an object that looked like a cube, but which changed shape every time I blinked. "The first test is one of intelligence," the Keeper's voice echoed. "Crack the code, solve the riddle, and prove that your species is capable of understanding the mysteries of the universe." "Doctor," Reeves immediately approached the pedestal, his eyes shining with scientific fascination. That's incredible. The equations, the symbols, it's like they're alive. While he and Dr. Chen began to analyze the floating symbols, I approached the mutable cube. There was something familiar about it, something that made my mind throb with an almost forgotten memory. "Wait," I said, a sudden realization hitting me. "This isn't just a test of knowledge, it's a test of perspective." Everyone turned to me, curious. "Look," I continued, pointing at the cube. "It changes because we're trying to understand it with our limited logic. But what if we tried to see how they see?" I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to open my mind to possibilities beyond my human comprehension. When I opened them again, the cube had stabilized into a shape that defied description. It wasn't a cube, or a sphere, or any other shape I could name. It was everything at once. "It's a key," murmured Dr. Chen, his eyes wide with understanding. "A key to deciphering the symbols." With this new perspective, the symbols and equations began to make sense. It wasn't language or mathematics as we knew it, but a completely new way of understanding the universe. We worked frantically, our minds stretched to the limit as we tried to decipher millennia of alien knowledge compressed into a single room. Finally, after what seemed like hours, or was it days, the pieces fell into place. The symbols lined up, the equations were solved, and a clear message emerged. The universe is more vast and wonderful than you ever imagined. You have taken the first step towards understanding it. The room around us dissolved again, and we found ourselves back on the platform where we had started. The Guardian was watching us, his form pulsing with an energy that now seemed almost approving. "You have passed the first test," his voice rang out. "You have demonstrated the ability to expand your minds beyond the limits of your current understanding. But the challenges ahead will test more than just your intelligence." As we prepared for the next test, I exchanged glances with my companions. There was a new sparkle in their eyes, a mixture of determination and something else. Hope, perhaps. But I knew we couldn't get carried away by the euphoria of our first success. The next challenges would be even more difficult, and the fate of the Earth still hung by a thread. The test of compassion awaited us, and with it, challenges that would test not only our minds, but our hearts and our very humanity. The brief moment of relief after overcoming the first test soon gave way to renewed apprehension. The Guardian, his ethereal form pulsing with an energy that seemed to reverberate through our souls, stared at us with what I can only describe as a cosmic intensity. "The next test," his voice echoed in our minds, "will assess your compassion. The ability to feel, to care, to sacrifice yourself for the greater good. This is the mark of a truly evolved civilization." Before we could fully process his words, the world around us began to dissolve again. The sensation was disconcerting, as if we were being taken apart at an atomic level and reassembled somewhere else. When reality stabilized, we found ourselves in a completely different environment. We were no longer in the alien structure of the moon, but in a city on Earth. The familiar streets of a metropolis surrounded us, with skyscrapers rising towards the sky. People hurried along the sidewalks, cars honked their horns in traffic. Everything seemed so normal. "This can't be real," muttered Dr. Chen, looking around with wide eyes. "It must be some kind of simulation." Major Hawkins nodded, his posture tense. "Stay alert. We don't know what to expect here." He had barely finished speaking when we heard a scream. Turning around, we saw a scene of chaos unfolding a few blocks away. An explosion had occurred, and injured people lay in the streets, crying out for help. My first instinct was to run to help, but something stopped me. A voice, the Guardian's voice, echoed in my mind. "Choose wisely. Your actions here will have consequences." I looked at my companions and saw the same conflict in their eyes. We wanted to help. It was our nature as human beings. But this was a test. What exactly was being assessed? Dr. Reeves was the first to move. "We can't stand by. People are suffering." He ran towards the scene of the disaster, with Dr. Chen close behind. Major Hawkins hesitated for a moment before following them, shouting orders to coordinate the rescue efforts. Lisa and I exchanged a quick glance before also joining in. As we ran, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The people around us, those who weren't injured, seemed indifferent, as if the explosion and the chaos were just another normal day. Arriving at the scene of the disaster, the scene was heartbreaking. Injured bodies, some moving weakly, others dangerously still. The smell of smoke and fear filled the air. We worked frantically, pulling people from the rubble, applying first aid, doing everything we could to save lives. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Each life saved brought a moment of relief. Each loss weighed heavily on our souls. It was then that I noticed something. While we were working to save the victims of the explosion, other tragedies began to unfold around us. A man had a heart attack a few meters away. A child fell from a third-floor window. A fire broke out in a nearby building. It was as if the universe was conspiring to create as much suffering as possible, and we couldn't be everywhere at once. "What do we do?" shouted Lisa, the desperation evident in her voice. "We can't save everyone." It was at that moment that the terrible truth of the test hit me. It wasn't just about helping. It was about choosing who to help, deciding who would live and who would die. "That's it," I said, my voice shaking. "The test isn't about saving everyone. It's about making impossible choices." The look of understanding that flashed across my companions' faces was devastating. We understood, all at once, the true weight of compassion. The next few hours were a nightmare of agonizing decisions. We had to choose between saving a child or a group of adults, between rescuing a doctor who could save more lives or a pregnant mother. Each choice saved lives, but also condemned others. Worst of all was the constant awareness that none of it was real. It was a simulation, a test. But the suffering, the pain in our hearts, the anguish of each decision, it was all terribly real. When there was finally no one left to save, when the streets were silent except for the distant echo of sirens and crying, we found ourselves gathered together again, exhausted and emotionally drained. It was then that the Guardian reappeared, his ethereal form hovering over us like a constant reminder of the true purpose of it all. "You have faced the test of compassion," his voice rang out, not just in our minds, but seeming to come from everywhere at once. "You've seen the weight of choices, the cost of care, but there is one final question." The world around us froze. The people, the buildings, everything stood still like a photograph. And then, in front of us, a vision materialized that made my heart stop. It was the Earth, our blue planet, beautiful and fragile, floating in the emptiness of space. And next to it, an exact replica of the scene of destruction we had just experienced, but on a planetary scale. "Choose," said the Guardian. "Save your world with all its suffering and imperfection. Or save this other world, where all the lives you couldn't save still live, where your difficult choices can be undone." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my companions and saw the same tearing conflict in their eyes that I felt in my heart. How could we make such a choice? How could we condemn an entire world, no matter what it was? Dr. Chen was the first to speak, her voice shaky but determined. "We can't abandon our world, no matter how imperfect. It is our home." Major Hawkins nodded slowly. "I agree. Our duty is to the Earth, to the humanity we know." Dr. Reeves looked tormented. "But what about all those lives? Can we really condemn them?" Lisa, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. Maybe true compassion isn't about saving everyone. Maybe it's about accepting that we can't, and still caring, still trying." His words reverberated in me, echoing a truth I felt but couldn't articulate. I looked at the Guardian, his impassive form awaiting our decision. "We chose Earth," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "Not because we don't care about the other world, but because we care too much about our own to abandon it." The moment that followed seemed to stretch on for eternity. The Guardian watched us, his energy pulsing in a way we couldn't interpret. Finally, he spoke. "You have made your choice. Compassion is not only measured by actions, but by the ability to carry the weight of difficult decisions. You have demonstrated that." With those words, the world around us began to dissolve again. The vision of Earth and the alternative world disappeared, and we found ourselves back in the alien structure on the moon. We were exhausted, emotionally drained, but there was a feeling of, I wouldn't say triumph, but perhaps that we had experienced something profoundly transformative. The Guardian watched us, his form now emanating something that almost looked like respect. "You have passed the second test," he said, "but the final challenge is yet to come. The test of will determine the fate of your species." As we prepared for whatever came next, I couldn't help but reflect on what we had just experienced. The weight of compassion, the cost of caring, the responsibility of making impossible choices. Would we ever be the same after that? The final test awaited us, and with it, I suspected, would come the greatest challenge we had ever faced, not just as individuals, but as representatives of the whole of humanity. The fate of the Earth rested in our hands. And for the first time since this journey began, I felt the true weight of that responsibility. The silence that followed the Guardian's announcement of the final test was deafening. We were exhausted, physically and emotionally, after the trials we had faced, but we knew that the toughest challenge was yet to come. The test of will, the Guardian's voice echoed in our minds, is the most crucial of all. For it is the will that drives a species to evolve, to overcome obstacles, to reach for the stars. We exchanged apprehensive glances. What could be more challenging than what we had already faced? Before we could contemplate any further, the world around us began to change again. This time, however, the transformation was different. Instead of transporting us to a new setting, we felt as if we were being pulled into ourselves. When the sensation passed, I found myself alone in an infinite void. There was no ground, no sky, just a vast nothingness stretching out in all directions. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the void. There was no reply. I tried to move, but there was no reference to direction. It was like floating in space, except that there were no stars. Nothing to orient yourself by. It was then that I heard the Guardian's voice, more distant and ethereal than ever. "The final test is individual. Each of you will face your own demons, your own weaknesses. Will is tested not in ease, but in extreme adversity." Scarcely had the words dissipated when I felt a growing pressure in my mind. Images started flashing before my eyes. Memories, fears, regrets. I saw my childhood, moments of failure and disappointment. I saw the faces of those I had let down throughout my life. The pressure increased, and with it came a voice, not the Guardian's voice, but a voice I recognized as my own, distilling every insecurity, every doubt I had ever had. "You're not worthy," the voice whispered. "You've never been good enough. How dare you think you can represent humanity?" I tried to fight the thoughts, but they seemed to intensify by the second. Visions of failure in our mission flooded my mind. I saw the Earth being destroyed, humanity doomed by my incompetence. "No," I muttered, my voice weak even to my own ears. "This isn't real. That's not me." But the visions continued, relentless. I saw my teammates blaming me. I saw the disappointment in the eyes of everyone I knew. The pressure was overwhelming, threatening to break me completely. It was then that something changed. Amidst the swirl of negativity, a memory surfaced. It was the moment I was selected for the mission. I remembered the feeling of pride, the belief that I could make a difference. "No," I said again, this time more forcefully. "I'm not perfect, but I'm capable. I was chosen for a reason." The negative visions wavered for a moment, but soon returned in full force. Now it wasn't just my personal failures, but the failures of all humanity that haunted me. Wars, famine, environmental destruction, every mistake our species has ever made paraded before my eyes. "Look," the voice hissed, "your species doesn't deserve to survive. You are a plague on the universe." For a moment, I felt my resolve waver. How could we defend ourselves in the face of all the atrocities we had committed? But then another memory surfaced. I remembered a sunset I had witnessed on Earth shortly before our mission. The beauty of that moment, the peace I felt, it was a reminder of all that was good in our world. "We're not perfect," I said out loud, my voice gaining strength, "but we're trying. We're evolving, learning from our mistakes." The negative visions began to recede, but the pressure in my mind remained. It was as if something was trying to crush me, to reduce me to nothing. I closed my eyes and concentrated. I thought of my teammates, of all the people on Earth who were counting on us. I thought of humanity's resilience, of our ability to overcome adversity. "We deserve a chance," I declared, my voice echoing in the void. "Not because we're perfect, but because we have the potential to be better, because we never give up." With each word, I felt my strength grow. The negative visions were dissipating, the pressure in my mind lessening. "I won't give up," I shouted into the void. "Humanity won't give up." Suddenly, everything stopped. The emptiness around me began to dissipate, and I found myself back in the alien structure on the moon. My companions were there, looking as exhausted and shaken as I felt. The Guardian hovered before us, his ethereal form pulsing with an energy that seemed different now, almost approving. "You have faced your deepest fears," his voice rang out. "You have confronted the failings of your kind, and yet you have chosen to persist. This is the essence of true will." I looked at my companions, seeing in their eyes the reflection of the internal battle each had fought. There was a new strength there, a determination forged in the fire of adversity. "The final test is complete," continued the Guardian. "You have shown the intelligence to understand, the compassion to care, and the will to persevere. But the journey of your kind is far from over." A tense silence fell over us. We had passed the tests, but what did that mean for humanity? "What happens now?" asked Major Hawkins, his voice hoarse but firm. The Guardian seemed to consider for a moment before answering. "Now you return. You return with the knowledge that you are not alone in the universe. You return with the responsibility of guiding your species towards a better future." "But what about the moon?" asked Dr. Chen. "What about you, the Guardians?" "The moon will return to its previous state," replied the Guardian. "The time for full contact has not yet arrived, but know that we are watching, waiting. The fate of your species is in your own hands." With those words, I felt a sensation of movement, as if we were being pulled back into the reality we knew. "Remember," the Guardian's voice echoed one last time, already distant. "The universe is vast and full of wonders, but also of challenges. Prepare yourselves, evolve. One day, we will meet again." And then, in the blink of an eye, we were back at our lunar base. The alien structures had disappeared. The moon looked as inert and familiar as it ever had. We looked at each other, still processing everything we had experienced. We were no longer the same people who had set off on a simple exploration mission. We were now carrying the weight of cosmic knowledge, the responsibility of a secret that could change the course of human history. "What do we do now?" asked Lisa, her voice trembling slightly. Major Hawkins took a deep breath before answering. "Now we go home, and we begin to prepare humanity for the future that awaits us." As we prepared to return to Earth, I couldn't help but take one last look at the lunar landscape. It seemed so ordinary, so innocent. Who could have imagined the secrets it held? One thing was certain. Our journey was not over. In fact, it had only just begun. And the future, with all its mysteries and challenges, awaited us. The return to Earth was surreal. After everything we had experienced, the journey back seemed almost anticlimactic. I watched through the window of the capsule as the moon, now seemingly harmless and familiar, receded behind us. It was hard to believe that that gray orb held such deep and frightening secrets. None of us spoke much during the trip. We were all immersed in our own thoughts, trying to process the extraordinary events we had witnessed. How could we even begin to explain what had happened? Who would believe us? As we approached Earth, the beauty of our blue planet hit me with a force I had never felt before. Now I truly understood how precious and unique our world was, and also how fragile. The landing was greeted with the usual celebrations and honors. We were heroes, they said, for having successfully completed the mission to establish a permanent lunar base. If they only knew. The days that followed were a whirlwind of debriefings, medical examinations, and interviews with the press. We stuck to our official story. The mission was a success. We encountered some unexpected challenges, but nothing we couldn't overcome. The truth was kept between the five of us, a secret that weighed heavily on our souls. It was during a private meeting with the high command of the space agency that things got interesting. We were all there. Me, Dr. Chen, Dr. Reeves, Lisa, and Major Hawkins. The mission director was watching us with an expression I couldn't decipher. "So," he began, his tone too casual to be genuine, "is there anything you'd like to share about the mission that isn't in the official reports?" We exchanged tense glances. It was Major Hawkins who finally spoke. "Sir, with all due respect, what we witnessed on the moon, we're not sure the world is ready to know." The director nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. "I understand," he said, "and I agree. What I'm going to say next is classified at the highest level of security." He paused, studying us carefully before continuing. "You're not the first to find anomalies on the moon. Since the 1960s, we've had evidence of unexplained activity there. The Guardians, as you called them, have made contact before. The revelation hit us like a bombshell." Dr. Chen was the first to recover her voice. "You knew. All this time, you knew, and you sent us anyway." The director sighed heavily. "We didn't know exactly what they would find. Every contact has been different. But we knew there was something there, something that could change everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe." "Why keep it a secret?" I asked, my mind spinning with the implications. Imagine the panic, the chaos that would ensue if the public knew that we were not alone, that there were beings with power beyond our comprehension watching and judging our species, replied the director. "Society as we know it could collapse." We were silent for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what we were hearing. It was Lisa who asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "What do we do now?" The director stood up, walking over to the window that offered a panoramic view of the city below. "Now we prepare humanity, not for immediate contact, but for a future in which we will be ready to face what awaits us out there." He turned to face us, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and something that seemed almost hopeful. "The five of you will be fundamental to this process. Your experiences, what you've learned about intelligence, compassion, and will. All of this will be crucial in shaping the future of our species." In the months and years that followed, each of us played a unique role in this silent preparation of humanity. Dr. Chen dedicated himself to research in advanced biology, looking for ways to improve our adaptability as a species. Dr. Reeves delved even deeper into astrophysics, using the knowledge gained to boost our understanding of the universe. Lisa focused on developing technologies that would allow us to explore further and deeper into the cosmos. Major Hawkins became an important strategist, working behind the scenes to ensure that we were prepared for any cosmic eventuality. And I became a kind of philosopher-scientist, looking for ways to expand human consciousness, to prepare us mentally and spiritually for the challenges that awaited us. Meanwhile, the world continued to spin, oblivious to what had actually happened on the moon. Sometimes, when I looked up at the night sky and saw that familiar orb hovering above us, I felt a shiver run down my spine. How many other secrets did the universe hold? Years passed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, humanity began to change. Scientific advances that used to take decades happened in years. Global awareness of our responsibility to the planet and to each other grew. It was as if, on some subconscious level, the human species was preparing for something greater. One clear night, almost a decade after our mission, I received an emergency call. It was the director, his voice urgent. "They're coming back. The Guardians, they've made contact again. My heart raced. This was it. The moment we had been preparing for so long had finally arrived. As I hurried to the meeting place, I couldn't help but look up at the sky. The moon was shining, as serene as ever. But now I knew the truth it hid. The future was uncertain, full of promise and danger. But I knew one thing for sure. Humanity would not face this future unprepared. We had been tested. We had learned. We had evolved. And now, finally, we were ready to take the next step on our cosmic journey. As the car sped through the night, taking me towards what would surely be the beginning of a new era for humanity, I couldn't help but smile. The warning we received in 1990, never to return to the moon, was not an end, but a beginning. It was the beginning of our true journey among the stars.